The coffee in my travel mug had gone cold long before I pulled my battered, mud-splattered Ford F-150 into the subterranean parking structure of Vance-Sterling Architecture Group. It was an old truck, a relic from the years when my knuckles were permanently stained with drywall dust and concrete, long before my name became a brand printed on glass-front skyscrapers across the Pacific coast. Today was Chloe's 23rd birthday, my daughter, the quietest, most brilliant soul I had ever known, and the only piece of my first life that still breathed with the warmth of the man who built it alongside me. I sat behind the steering wheel for a long moment, looking down at the passenger seat. Resting there was a modest bouquet wrapped in brown butcher paper, white spider lilies. They weren't exotic, and they didn't cost a fortune. They were the exact flowers her father, David, had planted in a messy, stubborn row along the back fence of our old cottage in Carmel by the Sea 4 decades ago, before a sudden structural collapse on a bridge site stole him away from us. Chloe had loved them since she was a toddler, learning to trace their fragile, sweeping petals with ink-stained fingers. I wore an old, oversized camel coat with frayed cuffs, the same coat I wore when I supervised my very first municipal contract in the rain, back when the world was made of hard labor and quiet ambition. My longtime business manager and former site engineer, Marcus, had glanced at it that morning with a knowing, heavy look, silently reminding me that my walk-in closet held dozens of tailored cashmere coats fit for a billionaire chairperson. I told him I knew. Some mornings don't ask for the corporate armor you built to survive the boardroom. They ask for the version of yourself that existed before the money made everyone look at you with calculated smiles. Chloe had taken an uncredited architecture internship at Vance-Sterling 8 months prior. She hadn't asked for my permission, and she had strictly forbidden me from using my influence. To everyone in that glass and steel monolith on Montgomery Street, she was simply a quiet, fiercely independent intern from an ordinary background, spending her nights hunched over drafting tables while others went home to cocktail parties. I respected her fierce pride entirely. I loved her for it. So I parked 2 blocks away, signed in at the front desk under a neutral visitor log, and took the freight elevator to the fourth-floor design department, carrying my simple bouquet like an ordinary mother visiting her hard-working kid. That was when the architecture of my own life began to fracture. The design department was partitioned by frosted glass panels that muffled ordinary conversations into dull hums. But human malice has a way of cutting straight through glass. A voice rang out from behind the corner office, sharp, cultivated, and dripping with a practiced cruelty that never needed to raise its decibels to draw blood. A pathetic little nobody from nowhere, the voice lashed out, cold as unheated steel. I froze mid-step in the carpeted hallway, my fingers tightened instinctively around the paper stems of the spider lilies. Another voice answered, subdued, painfully familiar, and carrying the unbearable stillness of someone who had learned to absorb impacts without crying out. It was Chloe, my daughter's voice, small and trembling. Then came a second voice, lazy, amused, and dripping with generational entitlement. It belonged to Amber Sterling, my 29-year-old stepdaughter, a woman whose entire career had been paved by my capital and my name, though she treated the empire as her personal playground. Mom, she's hopelessly clumsy, Amber laughed lightly, the sound of fingernails tapping against a polished desk. They literally scrape anyone off the street for these internships nowadays. Through a narrow gap between the doorframe and the frosted glass, the scene opened up before me like an X-ray of a rotten foundation. My daughter, a graduate with honors who could calculate load-bearing vectors in her sleep, was down on her knees on the polished concrete floor. Scattered all around her were dozens of hand-drawn architectural sheets, her entire semester's research torn across the middle. Standing above her was my current husband, Julian Vance, the CEO I had handpicked, promoted, and trusted to run the daily operations of the company I founded. Beside him stood Amber, her arms crossed, watching Chloe scrape the ruined paper together like a servant clearing debris. Neither of them looked back. Two senior designers standing near the cubicles stared fixedly at their computer screens, swallowing their silence, too terrified of Julian's wrath to offer a hand. I didn't storm through that door. I didn't scream, and I didn't let my grief spill over the carpet. Instead, I stepped backward into an alcove of shadows, letting them brush past me within arm's reach, entirely oblivious to the woman standing right beside them. I watched my daughter remain on the floor for a long, quiet minute, picking up the torn pages all by herself, her shoulders shaking with a silent, suffocating endurance. Something inside my chest didn't break. It crystallized. It turned into something infinitely colder, denser, and more permanent than rage. Standing there in the dim corridor, the geometry of the past 8 years suddenly rearranged itself with terrifying clarity. This wasn't an accidental confrontation. Julian had schedule logs. Amber had a pre-printed termination memo ready in her folder. They had chosen Chloe's birthday with surgical precision to inflict maximum psychological damage. They wanted her broken. And if they wanted her broken, they'd declared war on the wrong architect. I set the white spider lilies down gently against the base of the concrete pillar outside the department doors. I pulled out my phone, dialed a number that had stayed by my side through 3 decades of corporate warfare, and heard it pick up on the first ring. "Marcus," I said, my voice unnervingly flat, carrying the weight of an approaching avalanche. "Pull every financial audit, every subsidiary wire transfer, and every internal compliance log on Vance-Sterling Group for the last 24 months, and find out exactly how long Julian knows Chloe works under his roof. Not when he found out, how long he's known, and why he kept quiet." The drive from downtown San Francisco down to our cliffside home in Big Sur usually offered a space to think, but that evening the road felt like a narrowing tunnel. Every curve of the Pacific coastline seemed to echo the cold realization settling deep into my bones. By the time I turned the Ford into the stone driveway, the fog was rolling in thick off the ocean, blurring the sharp edges of the modern glass and steel architecture that Julian and I had built together. Or rather, the architecture I had funded and Julian had learned to manage. Julian was waiting in the entryway, leaning against the mahogany console table with a welcoming, practiced smile. True to his ritual, every single night for the past 2 years, he held a long-stemmed crystal glass filled with a deep, full-bodied Cabernet Sauvignon. It had started shortly after my 60th birthday, around the time I first noticed a faint, frustrating tremor in my right hand, a minor neurological nuisance I had casually mentioned to him over dinner. He had insisted then, with all the tender concern of a devoted husband, in pouring my evening glass himself, making sure I rested while he took care of the small details of the household. "You look tired, sweetheart," Julian said softly, handing me the glass with a gentle touch against my fingers. I took it, offering a tired smile that didn't reach my eyes. "It was a long day at the municipal sites, Julian. My hands are shaking more than usual." "That's why you have me," he replied, turning away just enough to check his phone as it vibrated against the wood. The moment his back was turned, I lifted the glass to my lips, letting it touch my tongue before discreetly tilting it sideways, pouring the dark liquid deep into the soil of a massive indoor fiddle leaf fig standing right beside the door. I handed the empty glass back to him a minute later, watching him nod with satisfaction before he walked off toward the kitchen. By midnight, the house was dead silent, save for the low, rhythmic crash of the waves against the cliffs below. I slipped out of bed, dressed quietly in dark wool, and got back into my truck. I didn't drive to a hospital in San Francisco where Julian's medical contacts might raise an eyebrow. Instead, I drove 2 hours straight through the dark to a private toxicology and clinical pathology lab tucked away in an industrial park in Oakland, a facility I had quietly funded years ago during my early days in commercial construction. I handed over a fresh blood sample and a sealed vial containing the leftover dregs of the wine I had scraped from the bottom of the glass in my hallway. Then I waited in the sterile, fluorescent-lit waiting room until dawn, letting the cold reality of betrayal wash over me. At 8 a.m. in the morning, Marcus arrived at my old timber workshop behind the Big Sur property, a quiet sanctuary where I used to cut wood before the corporate boardrooms demanded every waking hour. He didn't knock, he simply unlocked the side door and set 3 thick, hand-labeled binders on the heavy oak workbench. His face looked gray, carved from the same stubborn granite as his years in the Marine Corps and his decades managing my books. "You asked for the 24-month audit, Liz," Marcus said, his voice dropping low, stripped of any professional polish. "I wish I hadn't found what's inside these pages." I opened the first binder, and the numbers began to bleed across the paper, tearing down the illusion of my marriage piece by piece. Over the past 24 months, a systematic, calculated hemorrhage had been draining my personal accounts and the Vance family philanthropic foundation, small enough transactions to skate beneath the threshold of automatic quarterly reviews, yet relentless. A total of $4.2 million had been siphoned away, disguised meticulously under rows of fabricated invoices labeled as international architectural consulting fees, funneled straight into an offshore shell company registered in the Cayman Islands under the name Sterling Holdings, a corporation managed entirely by Amber and her father. I turned the page, and the air in the workshop seemed to grow heavy, suffocating. My current legal will, the master document governing the entirety of my $180 million real estate empire, had been modified just 4 months ago. Through an online electronic notarization portal, my signature had been digitally duplicated, transferring 100% of my estate away from Chloe and placing it squarely in the hands of Julian and Amber Sterling. The certifying legal entity listed at the bottom of the digital stamp wasn't my corporate counsel, it was Sterling and Associates Law Partnership, a firm Julian had secretly retained behind my back while I was recovering from a bout of winter influenza. Marcus stood quietly by the workbench, watching me trace my finger over the fraudulent signature. He didn't need to ask what I wanted to do next. He knew the woman who built skyscrapers from an empty plot of dirt didn't break when the foundation cracked. She calculated the load-bearing capacity of her enemies and prepared for the demolition. The binders on my timber workshop bench still smelled of fresh toner and cold paper when the phone on the wall interrupted the silence. It was mid-afternoon, the sunlight cutting through the dusty windows of the Big Sur property in long, unyielding beams. A stranger's voice, clinical, hurried, carrying the sterile panic of an emergency ward, announced that my daughter had been brought into Mercy General Hospital following a severe collision on Highway 1. A heavy-duty freight truck had slammed directly into the rear quarter panel of her sedan at highway speeds, crushing the trunk into the back seat before accelerating into the coastal fog without stopping. I didn't cry. Tears belong to a world where disasters are unpredictable, and what was happening to my family was a structured demolition. I drove the winding stretch of the coast with my hands locked onto the steering wheel, my knuckles white, feeling the cold, metallic pulse of absolute clarity replacing every trace of shock. When I pushed through the swinging doors of the emergency ward, Chloe was lying in a sterile white cubicle, wrapped in layers of gauze and medical tape. Her left arm was encased in plaster from elbow to knuckles. A fractured rib cage forced her to take shallow, pained breaths, and a jagged purple bruise spanned the delicate curve of her cheekbone. She looked small against the white sheets. Yet when she saw me step into the room, her eyes, the exact shade of green her father's had been, flashed with a sharp, surviving intelligence. She didn't whimper or ask for comfort. She simply reached out her uninjured right hand, caught my fingers, and pulled me close so she could speak without the nurse's hearing. "Mom, it wasn't a random accident," Chloe whispered, her voice dry, raspy, but cutting straight through the hum of the heart monitor. "They tried to stop me before I could finish." I sat down on the edge of the mattress, my thumb gently tracing the back of her hand, telling her without words that she was safe now. And then, piece by piece, between long gasps of pain, my daughter laid out a secret war she had been waging in the dark for over half a year. 7 months prior, while logging files on the shared cloud server at our home office, Chloe had stumbled on an unencrypted draft document, a preliminary version of my estate will that had been quietly routed through Julian's private terminal. Her name had been entirely excised, replaced with a sweeping trust that handed everything over to Julian and Amber. She hadn't known whether I was losing my mind and had requested the change myself, or if something darker was moving beneath the surface of our household. Unwilling to accuse her stepfamily without undeniable proof, and terrified of alarming me while she watched my hands shake over my evening wine, she chose silence. She chose observation. Instead of panicking, my 23-year-old daughter had turned herself into an invisible operative inside Vance-Sterling. Working late nights when the design department was empty, she had used a pocket-sized hardware keylogger and a hidden USB drive to duplicate the local drive of Amber Sterling's primary design terminal. What she found buried deep within the hidden directories wasn't just corporate espionage, it was a blueprint of betrayal. For over a year, Amber had systematically stolen proprietary urban zoning drafts from our firm's most lucrative municipal bids, leaking them directly to a competing real estate syndicate in Los Angeles for millions in kickbacks. Whenever internal compliance auditors began asking questions, Amber and Julian had quietly manipulated the internal tracking logs to frame the junior interns, making sure a trail of digital breadcrumbs pointed straight at Chloe's workstation to ensure her eventual disgrace and firing. The car on Highway 1 wasn't bad luck, it was simply the next escalation when office politics failed to break her spirit. Looking down at my daughter's bruised face, the fire inside me didn't overflow into blind rage. It compressed, turning into the cold, surgical instinct of an old builder who knows that when a load-bearing column is rotten to the core, you don't paint over the cracks, you prepare the explosives. I didn't call the local police department immediately. A standard police report filed through normal municipal channels would have given Julian's high-priced legal fixers time to scrub the servers, bribe a precinct clerk, and bury the evidence beneath an avalanche of procedural red tape. I needed something absolute. I pulled out my phone right there beside the hospital bed, dialed Marcus, and gave him a single precise directive. "Marcus, pull every traffic management camera, toll booth capture, and private dashcam feed along the 20-mile stretch of Highway 1 between 2 and 4 o'clock this afternoon. Find the license plate, find the rental registry, and trace every digital footprint back to the entity that paid for it." Marcus didn't waste breath asking questions. Within 3 hours, while Chloe rested under heavy sedatives, my phone buzzed with an encrypted message and a high-resolution snapshot pulled from a Caltrans traffic surveillance node hovering over the coastal ridge. The image showed a dark gray commercial utility truck speeding away from the crumpled wreckage of my daughter's car. The rear license plate was clearly visible, caught under the harsh glare of a roadside LED light. Marcus had already run the registration through the state commercial database. The vehicle didn't belong to a random contractor. It was leased through an enterprise subsidiary registered directly under the corporate umbrella of Sterling Holdings, the exact same Cayman-based shell company that had been quietly siphoning millions out of our family accounts. The enemy hadn't just invaded my home, they had driven a truck through my flesh and blood, thinking the old architect was too blind and weak to notice. They had miscalculated the foundation. The digital evidence linking Amber's corporate shell company to the truck that struck my daughter was only the outer shell of the structure. The real foundation of their deceit went much deeper, down into the dark, unrecorded corners of a past Julian had spent 8 years scrubbing clean before he ever stepped foot into my life. While I stayed by Chloe's hospital bedside through the quiet hours of the night, Marcus was digging through physical municipal archives, federal prison databases, and old court registries across 3 different states. By dawn, the second phase of the investigation landed on my desk, a thick dossier containing facts that turned my blood to ice. Julian Vance was never the brilliant, self-made financial consultant from a distinguished New England family he had claimed to be when we met 8 years ago. Marcus uncovered his original federal identification files tucked away in a regional record office in New Jersey, dating back to 2008. His original birth name was Julian Miller. He was a professional con artist with a 3-year federal penitentiary sentence on his record for systematic financial fraud and identity manipulation. The pattern of his life was written in the ruins of women who had trusted him. Years before he targeted my enterprise, Julian had infiltrated the life of a wealthy, recently widowed female executive in Boston, systematically draining her credit profiles, isolating her from her business partners, and seizing control of her estate. 14 months after their hurried wedding, that woman had died suddenly in her sleep, officially diagnosed with an acute cardiac event that no one investigated twice because Julian had managed her medical POA. Amber was never his adopted daughter either. Verification documents pulled from a county registry in upstate New York proved she was his biological daughter, born to a woman with an active federal record for insurance fraud and staged arson. They weren't a grieving, respectable family seeking a fresh start. They were a predatory syndicate that had spent decades perfecting the art of targeting self-made women who had built their fortunes with calloused hands and lonely hearts. They had chosen me because Vance-Sterling Architecture was a prize worth killing for, and to make sure I never noticed the dismantling of my life, they had turned my own home into a chemical prison. The toxicology report from the private Oakland clinic finally arrived while I sat in the dim hospital lounge. The findings identified consistent traces of lorazepam, a potent, slow-acting central nervous system sedative administered in microdoses over a period of nearly 24 months. It explained the frustrating tremor in my right hand that I had blamed on aging. It explained why I had felt so exhausted, so pliable, and so willing to let Julian take over the daily management of my corporation. Every single night, the glass of Cabernet Sauvignon he poured for me with such tender devotion had been systematically laced with a drug designed to turn the founder of an empire into a helpless invalid in her own home. When I read those medical conclusions, grief evaporated, leaving behind a cold, absolute resolve. I did not scream, and I did not run home to confront him with accusations that he could easily twist into signs of mental instability. I stopped touching anything brought from that kitchen immediately. Under the strict supervision of a trusted private physician, I began an aggressive medical detoxification protocol to clear the chemical fog from my nervous system, letting my mind snap back into the razor-sharp focus I had known when I first poured concrete foundations decades ago. At the same time, I initiated contact with Catherine Doyle, the most formidable senior litigator in the state of California, specializing exclusively in high-stakes corporate fraud, elder financial abuse, and systemic asset recovery. In a secure back office overlooking San Francisco Bay, far away from the listening devices Julian had likely planted in our private residence, Catherine and I reviewed every clause of our corporate bylaws. We drafted a series of airtight, confidential legal injunctions and asset freezes, laying down the exact structural framework to tear down the house of cards Julian and Amber had spent years building. They thought they had buried the old architect beneath a slow poison and forged papers. They had no idea I was simply waiting for the structural collapse they engineered to become the precise moment I pulled out the final support beams. While Marcus and I quietly reconstructed the financial wreckage behind the scenes, Julian and Amber were busy building toward the grand finale of their conspiracy. For months, they had treated Vance-Sterling Architecture Group like an orchard ready for clear-cutting, and now they believed the harvest was fully ripe. They scheduled their ultimate power play under the blinding lights of a landmark corporate celebration, the 10th anniversary Gala of Vance-Sterling Architecture Group, hosted inside the grand ballroom of the historic Fairmont Hotel in San Francisco. Invitations had been dispatched across 3 continents, pulling together all 300 major shareholders, international real estate syndicates, institutional investors, municipal leaders, and prominent members of the architectural press. Every heavy hitter in the Bay Area commercial construction sector was expected to be in attendance. To the public eye, it was a glittering milestone of corporate success. To Julian and Amber, it was the execution day of a carefully engineered coup. Their master plan was as bold as it was ruthless. According to confidential notes recovered from Amber's desktop by Marcus's digital sweep, Julian intended to take the stage mid-evening under the warm glow of the chandeliers. There, before the assembled elite and international press, he planned to present a series of fabricated neurological evaluations claiming that I, the founder and majority architect of the company, was suffering from advanced rapid-onset dementia. Under the guise of protecting the corporation from instability, he would publicly produce an emergency power of attorney mandate, pressuring me in front of hundreds of witnesses to sign away my voting rights and hand absolute control of the board over to him. Simultaneously, Amber was scheduled to take the microphone to formally accuse Chloe of industrial espionage, presenting forged audit trails to justify her immediate termination and permanent blacklisting from the architectural profession. They were planning to take my empire, destroy my daughter's future, and bury us both under a mountain of public humiliation, all wrapped in the benevolent smile of a devoted husband and father. They assumed I was still too chemically compromised by the lorazepam to notice the tightening of the noose. They assumed wrong. While Julian spent his days rehearsing his speech and coordinating with corrupt corporate public relations firms, my daughter and I were running our own parallel operation from opposite ends of the board. Working in absolute secrecy with Catherine Doyle, my private legal counsel, I quietly exercised a prenuptial financial option established long before I ever met Julian. Using independent private capital reserves that had never touched our marital accounts, I executed a binding legal contract to acquire 45% of the company's floating public shares from an overseas investment fund that had long sought an exit strategy. Combined with the foundation shares already locked securely under my direct name, this acquisition quietly tipped my ownership stake past absolute majority control. By the time the ink dried on the wire transfer, Julian and Amber were no longer managing an empire they could steal. They were sitting on top of a ticking clock that only I could disarm. Meanwhile, Chloe was fighting her own quiet battle from her recovery room and her private workspace. Despite her fractured ribs and bandaged wrist, she worked through the nights to complete the digital dossier. She successfully recovered every deleted server log, restored encrypted audio recordings of Amber's private strategy meetings plotting her framing, and compiled a comprehensive forensic ledger tracking the millions of dollars in illicit wire transfers flowing directly into Julian's offshore accounts. We didn't leak a single document, we didn't send warning emails, and we didn't alert the board members who had grown too comfortable with Julian's corporate charm. We maintained absolute silence, letting the conspirators walk deeper and deeper into the architectural trap they had meticulously laid for us. When the morning of the Fairmont Gala finally arrived, the city outside was wrapped in a heavy, gray San Francisco fog. Inside our Big Sur estate, I stood before the mirror and zipped up the classic black wool suit I had worn the day I buried my first husband, David, the man who taught me that true strength is measured by what you build when everything around you collapses. I looked at my hands. The tremor was entirely gone, replaced by the steady, unyielding grip of a builder holding a hammer. The stage was set, the audience was arriving, and the final act was about to begin. The grand ballroom of the Fairmont Hotel on Nob Hill was a breathtaking study in polished gold, white linen, and the soft, glittering reflections of 300 crystal chandeliers overhead. More than 300 invited guests, consisting of elite real estate developers, municipal leaders, corporate board members, and international journalists, mingled smoothly beneath the vaulted ceilings, raising long-stemmed crystal glasses of champagne in celebration of a decade of Vance-Sterling architecture. To anyone looking in from the outside, it was the pinnacle of corporate prestige and domestic harmony. To those of us standing at the epicenter, it was the execution ground. I stood near the edge of the mezzanine, watching the room move with the practiced precision of a well-oiled machine. Julian was working the crowd near the center stage, his silver hair catching the gallery lights, laughing smoothly with senior investors, while Amber hovered close by, playing the dutiful, brilliant corporate heiress. They were completely relaxed, entirely unaware that the foundation beneath their feet had already been excavated. They truly believed that tonight was the night they would finalize the seizure of my life's work and permanently banish my daughter from the industry. The room slowly dimmed as the ambient chatter subsided, drawing 300 pairs of eyes toward the elevated mahogany stage. Julian stepped up to the central podium, adjusting the microphone with a practiced, solemn expression of corporate gravity that immediately commanded the room's attention. He cleared his throat, flashed a warm, paternal smile toward the cameras recording in the back, and began his address to the elite assembly. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we celebrate 10 years of structural excellence, vision, and growth at Vance-Sterling. Julian's voice resonated smoothly through the state-of-the-art sound system, dripping with manufactured humility. Yet every great architecture must eventually transition when its foundational pillars grow weary. Due to rapid and irreversible health concerns regarding our beloved founder, Elizabeth Vance, specifically the onset of severe cognitive decline, the board has found it necessary to ensure absolute stability moving forward. He paused, letting a ripple of sympathetic murmurs wash over the crowd, before gesturing to the side steps with theatrical grace. In order to protect what we have built together, and with the full backing of our legal counsel, I invite my dear wife, Liz, to join me on stage so we may officially transition executive authority to hands that can guide this enterprise into the future. He turned his hand upward, extending an invitation for me to step into the spotlight under the gaze of 300 witnesses.
I didn't hesitate. I walked out from the shadowed side wing and stepped onto the brightly lit stage, dressed in a sharp, structured black velvet gown. My posture was straight, my movements deliberate, and my eyes, clear, unclouded, and devoid of any chemical haze, locked directly onto Julian's face. There was no tremor in my hands, no sign of the frailty he counted on. The moment the crowd saw my steady, unyielding expression, a subtle collective hush fell over the front rows as people began to realize something was profoundly out of sync with Julian's carefully rehearsed narrative. Julian smiled tightly, masking a sudden flicker of confusion, and reached into his leather portfolio to pull out a crisp, pre-printed power of attorney mandate. He extended it toward me with a fountain pen, expecting me to submit quietly under the weight of the cameras. "Sign here, my love," he murmured beneath his breath, his voice laced with forced warmth. I didn't take the pen. Instead, I simply stepped past him toward the center of the stage, turned my back to the podium, and raised 2 fingers toward the control booth at the rear of the ballroom. In an instant, the massive LED video wall towering behind the stage blinked off its corporate logo. For a heartbeat, the screen flickered black, and then the archival footage began to play. There was no celebratory retrospective. Instead, high-definition security camera footage illuminated the entire ballroom in sharp, uncompromising detail. The screen displayed the interior of the design department storage room, clearly showing Amber Sterling intentionally taking a utility knife and slicing a deep, jagged tear straight through Chloe's final masterpiece gown and master portfolios. Before the gasps in the audience could even form words, the audio feed abruptly switched, playing crystal-clear recordings of private phone conversations between Julian and their corporate legal team, openly discussing how they had systematically administered low-dose sedatives into my evening wine to simulate cognitive failure and forge my estate documents. The grand ballroom plunged into a dead, suffocating silence, broken only by the distant hum of the ventilation system and the horrifying playback of Julian's own voice echoing off the crystal chandeliers. Amber went completely white, dropping her champagne flute onto the marble floor, where it shattered into 1,000 sharp pieces. Julian spun around toward the screen, his face draining of all color, as the trap finally snapped shut around him. The silence stretched to its breaking point before I reached out and took the handheld microphone from the podium and let my voice ring out across the entire hall, cold, steady, and sharp as structural steel. "Julian Miller," I said, my words cutting through the stillness with absolute finality. Before he could step back or stammer a defense, I reached into the pocket of my velvet gown and pulled out a heavy stack of legal documents, lifting them high for the room and the press to see. "What you are looking at is not a transfer of power," I announced to the stunned crowd, my voice echoing off the high vaulted ceilings. "It is a federal asset freeze, an immediate court-ordered warrant for corporate fraud, and the certified proof that as of this afternoon, I hold 72% absolute majority ownership of Vance-Sterling. You built your entire house of cards on forged names and stolen lives, Julian, and the demolition has just begun." Before the shockwaves sweeping through the crowded Fairmont ballroom could settle into murmurs, the heavy mahogany double doors at the rear of the grand hall swung wide open with a sharp, echoing crash that silenced every single person in the room. A full tactical unit of federal law enforcement officers and municipal investigators marched straight down the central aisle, their uniforms unsmiling, carrying the absolute and unyielding authority of the law. They walked in a precise, disciplined formation directly toward the elevated stage, cutting through the stunned silence of the 300 elite guests, international real estate developers, municipal leaders, and flashing camera lenses that captured every second of the unfolding downfall. Before Julian could recover his balance, process what was happening, or reach for the legal papers in his briefcase, cold steel handcuffs snapped sharply around his wrists with an unforgiving click. Amber shrieked, stumbling backward against the expensive floral arrangements as a female investigator secured her arms behind her back as well. In front of the entire corporate world and the global press, the masterminds of a multi-million-dollar deception were led out in total disgrace. The charges read aloud by the lead investigator echoed off the crystal chandeliers with clinical precision. Aggravated poisoning, organized financial fraud, corporate identity manipulation, and criminal vehicular assault linked directly to the highway hit and run that nearly took my daughter's life. The months that followed were defined by a thorough, unsparing legal reckoning that left no stone unturned. In a federal courtroom overlooking the bay, the elaborate veil they had manufactured over the years was completely stripped away. Julian Miller received a strict 15-year prison sentence without the possibility of early parole, stripped of every hidden asset, fake identity, and offshore shelter he'd spent decades accumulating. Amber was handed a 5-year sentence with rigorous state supervision, mandatory community restitution, and a permanent legal order barring her from ever stepping foot near any commercial design or architectural firm again. The legal firm that had notarized the forged estate documents was dismantled by state bar investigations, and every penny they had siphoned from our family accounts was legally frozen and returned to its rightful foundation. With the rot finally excised from its deep roots, Vance-Sterling Architecture Group underwent a complete structural reorganization from top to bottom. The corrupt board members who had looked the other way or accepted bribes were replaced by seasoned professionals, chosen strictly for their unyielding integrity. My daughter, Chloe, returned to the company, but she did not walk back in through a back door or hide behind my shadow. The board unanimously appointed her as the new director of creative development, a position she earned purely through the brilliant, uncompromising portfolio and rock-solid resilience she had demonstrated throughout the entire storm. No special favors, no shortcuts, just the raw, undeniable talent of a young architect who had survived the fire and emerged stronger than ever. By the time December rolled around, the harsh winter winds had softened into a crisp, clear coastal breeze across the Pacific. I slid behind the steering wheel of my battered, mud-splattered Ford F-150, the exact same truck that had carried me through decades of hard labor on construction sites before the skyscrapers ever rose, and placed 2 modest bunches of fresh white spider lilies across the passenger seat. I drove down the familiar coastal highway to the newly redesigned downtown headquarters, carrying the flowers straight up to Chloe's sunlit office on the top floor. On her desk, sitting right beside her computer monitor, the dried, curled stems of the flowers from her birthday months before still rested inside a simple ceramic mug. She keeps them there until they are completely gone, a quiet, daily reminder of where we started and what we survived together. We sat across from each other in the warm December sunlight, looking out through the massive glass windows toward the endless blue horizon of the Pacific. We didn't waste breath speaking of hatred, revenge, or the bitter shadows of the past. Life had taught us a profound, unyielding lesson. The people closest to your heart are not always the safest for your soul, and true love without discernment is simply vulnerability in an expensive suit. But we also learned that a cracked foundation does not mean the building must fall. When built with a clear mind, an unyielding spirit, and a mother's fierce, quiet resolve, Even the most devastating collapse can become the exact place where you finally learn how to stand tall.
Before we say goodbye, I want to talk to you for just a moment. Wherever you are right now, what city are you sitting in, and what time is it on your clock as you watch this? Let me know in the comments below so I can see just how far this story traveled to reach you. More importantly, looking at this story, what is the biggest lesson you are taking away today? Is it about the strength to stand back up when everything is stripped away, the courage to walk away from toxic bonds, or the realization that human dignity and self-respect can never be bought with a price tag? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one, and I would love to know how this resonated with you. If this story touched your heart, please hit the like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss our next story. Thank you so much for watching. Stay strong, protect your peace, and I will see you in the next video.